We're going to wait a little bit for the stream to go live. Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to move the camera down a little bit. Perfect. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Portland PowerShell user group. We are here once again for our monthly meetup. This month we'll be talking to Chris Gardner about PowerShell best practices. He's kind enough to join us from the UK at, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around 2:30 a.m. He can correct me later on if I'm wrong about that, but we definitely do appreciate him staying up very late in the night to educate us about some of the good things that we can do with PowerShell and how we can make our PowerShell better. Before we get started, I do want to thank our sponsors. We have Sapien sponsoring our food for the evening. We're always appreciative to them for that. Sapien is a well-established name in the PowerShell community, and if you need some good PowerShell tools, look them up. Viewpoint Software is also providing our venue, as they always do. We have an excellent venue here thanks to Viewpoint Software. They've been great to us, and we really appreciate that. For everybody in the room, after the presentation, we will do some intros, some roundtables, talk some PowerShell news, talk some shop, and do a little bit of networking. But in the meantime, I'll just go ahead and kick it off to Chris and say thanks for appearing, and take it away.
No problem. Can you see my screen?
Gotcha.
Yeah. Excellent. So I'm Chris Gardner. I'm a DevOps consultant at a software company called Black Marble in the UK. I've been working with PowerShell for at least 5 years. I kind of forget at this point. I was recently made a Cloud and Data Center Management MVP, which basically means I talk about PowerShell probably more than is healthy. I spent the last couple of years working on building software and writing DSC stuff and deploying environments for testing that software. I maintain a couple of DSC resources on GitHub, and I'm usually on the main PowerShell Slack and the UK one, and that's my GitHub link where I've got a variety of things, including all my presentations and demos and stuff. So we're going to look at why we need these best practices. We're going to look at some function design, the general structures you can take for laying out your module. We'll look at the folder structure for where the actual files go. We'll have a quick look at build scripts, a quick overview of testing, and a quick discussion about documentation. Because if I didn't, then Michael would probably kill me. So why is quite a big and important thing to discuss about this? I've been to plenty of sessions, and I'm sure a lot of you have, where people discuss some really cool new technology or new thing they're doing, and they talk about the what about it and how, but they never really talk about why they did that or why you should use this technology other than it solves this really interesting problem. So I figure it's quite important to discuss why these best practices matter, and most importantly is because we're developers, we're technologists, we're a whole variety of other random words, but we're people who write code and push that code into production and whatever production may mean for you, and we kind of have to take some responsibility for that and make it meaningful, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. And it's, yeah, there's lots of people who, for most people, the job is 9 to 5, but, you know, it's not that easy. And, you know, if you're turning up to a user group after hours, then you probably care enough about what you do and at least some of what you do that you want to learn more and be better at everything you do. And because we do work with PowerShell, we want to generally do less work because we've automated a whole bunch of it away. But also importantly, it's makes, if we follow these standards, it's easier for other people to contribute to our work. You know, the more code that's in my module that I didn't have to write, even better. And when someone comes along and goes, oh, I've got this problem, I really wish your module did X, well, I go, well, that's great. Put in a pull request and I'll have a look at it, and you know, you can contribute to this module as well. That doesn't have to be open source stuff. It can be internal projects where you're like, yeah, some other teams like, oh, we really want to do Y. You're like, great, write it up, send me the code, and off we go. And sort of importantly, it's easier for people to use because we can write all these awesome modules and tools and stuff, but if we're the only people who can ever use them, that kind of reduces the real value anyone's getting out of them. So yeah, making things easier for other people to use is pretty important in this. So let's look at function design. Hopefully we've all written some amount of functions. The important stuff is obviously like a function should only ever do one thing and one thing only. And it should be very focused on that. But we can make them a bit more useful and a bit more easier to maintain, I guess, is quite a useful way, and readable by adding some extra functionality to them. So there's like, so you can specify an output type from a function to specify what sort of objects come out of it, which helps with get help telling you what sort of data you're getting out of it, and it'll help when you're writing scripts that make use of them, and it'll give you some options for like the different properties that are going to come out of these out of these functions. Then you've got to try and output these objects that your function is generating. So you can use write output and then the variable you've produced, or just the variable on its line, on a line on its own. Lots of people use return, which doesn't always do what you think it does, at least if you're coming from another programming language. And it's necessary in classes, but not in normal functions. So I generally try to stick to either write output or just using the variable name on a line on its own. Commandlet binding is a really, really useful feature. It'll give you a whole bunch of extra functionality for one line of code. So like all of your common parameters like verbose, debug, error action, information action, all of those really default, like what we consider the default things that all of the out of the box commandlets come with, is all provided purely by commandlet binding. So you should almost always add that to your functions. There are a very limited number of times when you don't want to add that, when it's very simple helper functions, but for the most part, commandlet binding is like the first thing I add after giving my function a name. And then we get to pipeline input. So my general rule is that any function I write which can change stuff, so my sets, my updates, my removes, should all accept pipeline input from a get commandlet of the same type, of the same name. So if I've got the best examples is things like get AD user, you can pipe that straight into set AD user, or get item and remove item. That sort of combination means that lots of users will be like, okay, well, I know get AD user and set AD user work. I wonder if your custom function of get user and set user work the same way. And if you add a little bit of code and it'll just work. Well, mostly. I'll show you a demo of that in a minute. So we can output custom objects quite easily, but we can't do a lot with them by default. So that's where PS type name comes in quite useful. You can define a custom type name for your object and then apply formatting to it using the same sort of formatting rules as other objects have. You can limit what sort of input can go into your functions based on the type name you provide. And it's quite a nice and useful feature. It's a bit less necessary if you're doing if your entire estate is PowerShell version 5 and above, because then you can make use of classes, which give you a whole bunch of extra functionality on top of that. But it's for those times when you have to support all the versions of PowerShell, then the PS type name is quite nice. It's pretty good. And then we've got descriptive variable and function names. We all know that naming things is difficult. It's supposed to be one of the most difficult things to do in IT. But just having sensible names for stuff is really, really useful, not just for end users who can see what parameters are called, but also internally when you go look at the function, you're like, what am I talking about here with a $name variable? Is that a username? Is that a computer name? Is that the name of the, I don't know, the file I'm talking to or I'm working with? So having those descriptive variable names makes everyone's lives a lot simpler. And yeah, common parameter names. So if you want computer names, call your parameter computer names. Maybe throw an alias on there for server names or something like that. But keeping those common names that we see in all of the other core commandlets makes that discoverability so much easier for your end users and makes your life a bit easier as well, so you get slightly less questions about stuff. So let's have a quick demo of some function design stuff. Let's quickly change this theme. Right, so I've got this function here, get user data. It has my lovely command binding, which is really useful. I'm outputting a PS custom object. I'm expecting a name that could probably be called username or identity to try and tie in with like the AD command. Let's call it identity is the property name, but yeah, breaking one of my own rules already. And then I output an object with the name, email, computer name, and this custom PS type name. So this just has to be a string. It doesn't really matter what's in the string. I generally go with module name and then dot the type of object I'm putting out. So in this case, user data. But if I'm working with VMs, I might have dot virtual machine or dot VM or dot vSwitch or something like that. So let's quickly load that into my session. So I can do get user data Dave, and then I've already got with the command binding. I get all of these extra options and extra parameters I can make use of, which can give you quite a bit of extra useful functionality for, yeah, as I say, one line of code. So I get my object back. As you can see, you can't see the type name because it becomes a hidden property on the object. So nothing that's going to impact user experience. Then we've got my set commandlet. It accepts values from the pipeline. So I've got my nice pipeline input. And in this case, I'm saying one of the parameter sets is my custom object type. In this case, yeah, I only accept objects of custom.userdata. And if I want to, I can pass in names as well. So for those times when I don't want to pipe in my get data, I want to just call it with the names from the command line. Yeah. So then I've got a quick check of if you pass me a custom object, do something with that user. In this case, I'm just changing the computer name. Otherwise, if you've given me the username, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the get user data and then pipe it into set user data. So I'm not duplicating a whole bunch of code. I'm just reusing a function I know works and outputs the object I expect and piping it straight back into itself. One change I always forget to make is making sure this accepts an array. So yeah, I'll do it. So if you're going to accept pipeline input, you should generally accept arrays of things, because then a user can provide an array normally. So if I do set user data, it helps if I load this in the session. Let's try that again. So if I have a name, and I say I've got 4 people I want to send their names through, John, it'll accept the array this way, or should. I know I've done wrong. For each in there. I always make these changes in the middle of a presentation and forget to commit the changes. So, okay, yeah, I've broken this horribly. Let's try that the other way around. It helps if I make them actually strings. Yeah, I've really broken this. Try that again. One last time. There we go. So now I'm getting my object back with the updated computer name, because I've just piped the object through. And if I'd done it correctly the first time, I probably would have been able to do that by just doing set user data and passing it an array of things rather than using the pipeline. So it's important to have that support for both methods of doing it. And I need to make sure I update this example to be a bit better in the future. So you can see there, there's 2 reasonably simple functions. And these can do obviously a lot more. They can go off and, like, the get user could go off and talk to my HR system or my AD and pull a bunch of data together. And my set function just accepts both that user data type and normal names that I might pass it on the command line, and then does something with that data, whatever the thing needs to do. So yeah, that's one example of how to write reusable functions that are easy to that will work together quite well, but will work fine on their own. And in the next day or 2, I will publish a better version of this that actually works correctly. Yeah. So back to the slides. So module structure is a bit of an interesting one. So most of us start off with a big PS1 file with a bunch of different functions in, and we decide, I want to make this into an actual module. So you just rename the file to .psm1 and drop it in the right folders. And that's great to start with. As you can see here, this is an example of one where it loads pretty quickly. There's only 20 or 30 functions in this file. But the problem becomes it's a bit of a pain to maintain it. Like, this one is probably, I don't know, maybe 1,000 lines of code, which is not too long, but it's still getting to the point where you're scrolling a lot or jumping around the file a lot to make any changes. Because it's in source control and I try to make changes to multiple parts of the file that I can get, or other people are making changes, you can get merge conflict, which get a bit of a pain to resolve, and just tracking changes across a big file is really difficult. So the solution a lot of people came up with, and there's quite a few blog posts on this, is dot sourcing. So everyone, you split all your functions into individual files, your PSM1 file instead just has get me all of the files under here and dot source them into the current session. It's a nice, simple approach. It's quite a powerful approach as well because it scales very easily as you add more and more files. As long as they're all in individual files, everything just automatically loads. The problem we run into is that it's pretty slow. You can see the example there is it's gone from 49 milliseconds to 740. That's not noticeably slow for most people because, again, there's only 30 or so functions in this. The problem becomes when you have more than that or the function is quite complicated. So the example I always give is PowerShell get, that wonderful module we've all used, or probably all used. Originally, when it was that was a one giant PSM1 file, which was 16,000 lines of code in a single file, which is very, very difficult to manage and maintain. So someone went through a whole bunch of effort, split the whole thing out into individual files, used dot sourcing to regenerate, to import everything correctly. And the import time ended up being something like 12 seconds to just import the module. And that's not really feasible for a module that people use reasonably often. And especially since that'll impact, if I do get command module PowerShell get, it will take at least 12 seconds to find all of the commands in that module because it has to partially import it. And that involves going through all of this, the whole process of the dot sourcing. And the other issue you often run into is that as soon as you start signing your files, which depending on where you're publishing them, you probably should be doing, you have to sign every single one of those PS1 files. And that brings with it a whole bunch of extra delay as it tries to check the signing on every single one of those files. So I haven't tried that with something like PowerShell get, but I imagine it would be pushing it up to 30 plus seconds to import. That's definitely not a viable approach. So the solution that some of us are starting to adopt and push for more of the wider community to use is what I'm calling compiled PSM1 or concatenated, or I haven't figured out a good word for it. But basically, we take a similar approach to dot sourcing in that we have all of our functions in individual files, but we then have the build process where we just take the content of all of those files and add it into the PSM1 file, literally going with get content, pipe to add content. And then we just, when we actually ship this to our end users, we only ship the PSD1 file and the PSM1 file. So we get all of the benefits of a single large file for the PSM1, which loads pretty quickly, but we get the easier benefit of maintaining lots of little files, which are so much better to work with when you're working with source control. It still scales really well because your build process handles all of that automatically, and it loads nice and quickly. The only problems you really get is that it takes a bit more time to get your head around how this process works, and you really, really want some automation to handle this. But we're writing PowerShell, so I think we can probably write some PowerShell to do this. And a little bit of more automation in our lives isn't a bad thing. And so I will show off a build script I use a bit later on to handle this. There's a couple of other projects out there for doing the same sort of process. And the problem I have with whenever I talk about this topic is I always use words like compiled and build. And although that's really what we're doing, they're very devy words, and lots of people don't like being called a dev, even if you kind of are. As soon as you click save on a script file, you're basically a dev. You know, you've probably put a bit more effort into thinking about security and stuff, but that's, you know, not too much different from plenty of other devs that I know. So the important thing that all of these also have in common is the module manifest. This is our PSD1 file. You can generate it with new module manifest. It's really important that you have one. It has a whole bunch of useful metadata in it, and it'll make the importing of the module a bit faster, and some cases require having one. Important to note that the name of the folder and the name of the PSD1 file should match in both in name and in casing. Obviously, for it to be a valid, for PowerShell to auto detect that a module is a valid module, it needs the folder and either the PSD1 or the PSN1 to match the name. If you're using a PSD1 file, the PSN1 can be called whatever you want, but as a general good practice, keep everything named the same. But having the casing matching is very important now that PowerShell is cross-platform, because Windows won't care. You know, you can have upper cases for your folder name, but lower cases for your PSD1 file. Linux will care and will see those as completely different things, and therefore won't load your module. So getting that casing the same is really important. And within your PSD1 file, you can specify what functions you're exporting, what commandlets, what aliases, variables, and stuff. Most people default to star as the wildcard of just everything that I've told you can export, just export it. The problem with that is that it's slower, which, you know, isn't hugely noticeable for your normal modules that are like 20 or 30 commandlets. But for bigger modules like PowerShell Get or DBA tools is quite a good example of that, because that's got 500 and something public public functions. So having a star there means PowerShell has to read your entire module and figure out which of these are actually being exported. There's also the problem that in constrained language mode and no language mode, if you have a star as any of those attributes, PowerShell just won't import your module and won't let you use it. So in those environments where you have locked down language modes in use, you need to be very explicit in what you're exporting and what's available. So then we look at, now we've talked about the concept, I guess, behind how a module should be laid out. We then have to look at the more logical view of how do all of these files actually look, and how do I lay out my folder structure for my repository. So this is roughly how I lay out my modules these days. I have a source folder where my functions go. I have a private and public folder within there. I go backwards and forwards whether it's private, public, or internal, external. I think I've kind of stuck with private and public these days because it fits with other programming languages in their concept of private and public methods, and it kind of makes it a bit easier for other people moving on to working with the project. And I have a PSD1 file that is the name of my module in there as well. So around that, I've got a git ignore file because I'm working with source control. I don't want Git to check some things in. In this case, it's mostly the output folder where my build will drop its stuff. I've got my .vs code folder, so I can do some settings and stuff. So that'll help me enforce things like where I want my braces to go, and if I want trailing white space on lines and a few other things. It'll also let me specify task.json files, launch.json I think it's called these days, which lets me enable like F5 functionality within VS Code, so I can quickly debug and run my test suites locally before I commit them and make my CI system do it. I have a depend file there, which is for PS depends, which lets me handle my dependencies that I have at build time. So things like Pesta, Platypus, what else is in my one at the moment? Any actual dependencies my module has when it'll be published, they go in there as well so that my tests can run correctly. I've got a build PS1 file, which I'll go over soon. I have a README so that people coming along to this project kind of get an idea of what the project's about, any things that are required to get started with the project, like how to build and how to use my project. Quite importantly there as well as the license file. So if you're working in open source, you need a license file. It needs to be whatever license that you want to apply. MIT is quite a popular one. There's a few others that are quite good, but again, it depends on who you want to reuse your code and all of the other things that come with licenses. But if you have an open source project without a license file, no one can use your code because that's just how the licensing works. And if you're doing internal stuff, you don't really need a license file, but it's probably worth putting your standard company license file with it anyway, just to be sure. I also have a docs folder there, which I'll get into soon enough. So it's a bit of a pain to set all of this up and repeatedly. So we automate it like we do with everything else. If you're going to do it more than 1 or 2 times, automate it. So there's some templating systems like Plaster and PS Module development, where you can configure how you want your folder structure to look, and it will go off and build them produce it for you every time you want a new module. They're pretty useful. PS Module development is more generic, I guess is probably the best word for it, but has some really cool documentation, and Fred, the main developer on it, is always around and more than happy to talk about both that and some of his other modules. Sometimes he does talk about it quite a lot in the PowerShell Slack as well. So if you ever want to have a look into that, that's around. He's always around for helping with that. And Plaster is much more PowerShell focused on this sort of thing, so it's quite useful for quickly scaffolding out basic module layouts. So some quick general good practice on module stuff. So module versioning is really, really important. For the most part, we kind of sort of follow Semver, for those people who are aware of it. Generally, if you see a module with a note point something, then it's still a preview version, and you can expect breaking changes between minor versions, and when it goes to 1.0 or 1. Whatever, there's probably going to be either breaking changes or at least stuff changing between the 0 point versions. So the general rule is if the major version number changes, then there can be breaking changes, but if you're going to make breaking changes, then you should change the major version number. The minor version number should change if you're making new feature improvements, bug fixes, just generally producing new versions of the module. And then you have the revision number, which is kind of mostly for your purposes rather than other people's. It's kind of how many times have you built this version of a module before publishing it publicly. Some people also use that for minor tweaks and fixes and stuff. So if you changed a bunch of the documentation and fixed a couple of bugs, you're like, well, it doesn't really warrant a minor version number change. I'll just increment the revision. Depends entirely on your process, but major.minor is the numbers I generally care about as a customer. And then the revision is whatever the developer cares about for. The other interesting problem that I've run across on a side project I was working on was people creating functions and commandlets with the same name as other existing functions and commandlets. So I was working on a project that involved, for various reasons, pulling down every module from the PS gallery and then doing a whole bunch of analysis on them. And I discovered people had created copies of out default, but they hadn't. They just produced commandlets and functions with the same name. So when you import it, everything works pretty much the same as you expect. But as soon as you remove it, the original out default doesn't come back because it's part of the one of the core snap-ins that isn't a problem in PowerShell 6 and onwards, but is a problem in earlier versions where snap-ins are still a thing. So if you're not aware of what out default does, at the end of every single line of PowerShell, completely hidden away from normal view, is a piping to out default, which basically just pushes whatever has come down the pipeline to the default output. So normally it's the console host, but it might be storing in a variable or wherever else. So weird things happen when you remove this function, because now you can't get any output to the screen or anywhere else, and you get random exceptions because things can't output stuff. It makes using that instance of a console very, very difficult. So when I was working on this project, it was taking a little bit of time, shall we say, to open a new console, because I think I had something like 55,000 commandlets available, which PowerShell generally quickly iterates over when it launches a new session. So it was taking 30, 40 seconds to open a new console. And once out default was removed in these few edge cases, it was like, oh, well, now I can't use this console. I have to close it and open it again. And that happened a few times before I was able to fix my process and try and narrow down where the problem was. So the solution to this, and it's generally a good idea anyway, is if you're going to make create a function to do something an existing function does and build on it, then you should name it suitably for your module and then create an alias that has the same name. So if I was replacing out default, I'd may make out Chris default and then have an alias for out default pointing to that. So when my module's removed and the session continues, that alias goes away and the original comes back and has been affected and just continues working. The only real time that you want to ignore this is if you're using proxy functions, but that's quite an edge case that I don't think a lot of people use proxy functions are aware of them, and that's a whole different topic that other people have covered quite well. But yeah, it's something to be very aware of is doing that. I'm sure I ran into another problem with that project where someone wrote some other code that I was making use of, I think, invoke REST method, and someone had written a caching version of invoke REST method. But I'm constantly polling this endpoint and just getting the same data back. I'm like, it shouldn't be changing. I don't know why it's not. It took a little bit of time to figure out someone else had copied invoke REST method and hadn't bothered aliasing it. So I had to work around that as well. Some interesting problems on that project. So build scripts. These are like pretty much any other sort of scripts, really. It's just automating that boring task of copying all my stuff together. The two big frameworks for doing this are invoke build and Sake. They're both kind of task runners that you can write. They handle dependencies and a whole bunch of other useful things. They're really useful because they're not platform dependent. So I can take my Sake scripts and run them on AppVia or Azure Pipelines or GitLab. Whereas if I write a build in Azure Pipelines, I can't easily transfer that between other platforms. So yeah, you can then use those on any of these many CI platforms that are out there. The big ones these days are Azure Pipelines, AppVia, GitLab, Travis, Jenkins, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But as far as I'm concerned, a build script should do 3 things at a minimum. And that's build your PSM1 file from all of your PS1 files. It should test that and then script analyzer that. And the important part there is that your tests and your script analyzer should target the completely built PSM1 file, not your individual PS1 files. Because if you target your PS1 files, then those tests might pass. But you're not testing the same thing you're shipping to your customers. And there might be all sorts of random bugs that occur because as part of the build process. So like if I've missed a closing curly brace out of one of my PS1 files, the tests might pass for whatever reason, or if it's a PS1 file I don't have tests for yet, then everything looks good because I'm testing the functions. It's great. But as soon as I put all of that together, that missing curly brace ruins the whole thing, and end users complain and get very upset that I'm giving them bad code. Same process with script analyzer. You want to test the complete PSM1 file so you know you're shipping exactly the same thing as you've tested, and you know it's reasonably good. I will show you my example of my probably over complex build script in a few minutes. Quickly cover testing. So there's a whole bunch of much better talks on testing. It's a whole big area, but Pesta's great. You really, really want to be doing some level of testing of your code, at least to validate some level, your basic expectations about it. As I say, test against the complete PSM1 file or your module or whatever. If you're still using dot sourcing, fine. Just do your import module, point it at the PSD1 or PSM1, and work that way. It's a huge saving. I've had a few people come up to me after I've done this sort of talk and say, I'm really glad I made that change because it found bugs that I would not have found until I was running in production. And some of them were pretty big bugs that would have caused huge problems in production, which you generally don't want to happen. And the basic rule is, if you find a bug, or if anyone finds a bug in your code, write a test for it. Write 5 tests for it. Write as many tests as you need to show all of the different possibilities for that bug, and then fix it and make sure your tests all pass. You should probably run them before you fix it to make sure they all fail, because that's kind of one of the pushes that you should be doing is write your tests first, write your code. I never quite do it that way. I write some of my tests, then write some of my code, and then fill in the gaps. That's just how I end up working these days. And lastly, but quite importantly, documentation. It's really, really useful. Like we all hopefully use GitHelp a lot. There's documentation out there that we all end up using. So write some documentation for your end users and for yourself and for other people coming along to it. It's a bit of a pain. I would much rather be writing more code than writing documentation, but it saved me a bunch of time. And I know I've gone back to code and went, why did I write this function again? What's it supposed to do? Even no, reading the function name's one thing, but I'm like, what does it actually do? If I read the documentation on it, I'm like, okay, that makes a lot more sense. So there's tools like Platypus to generate external help files. They can convert comment-based help into markdown files, so you can publish them on wikis and read the docs and the various other things. And it'll convert your markdown into external MAML files that you can ship with your module, because no one particularly wants to ever write XML, and MAML definitely not, because it's a really awful, horrible version of XML. And because you've written all this help and documentation, you should teach and remind users about get help. So an example that Rob Sewell always gives is that when a user comes to you and says, how do I use your function? You say, well, have you run get help and then the function name? Obviously, they very rarely have. You go, okay, well, try that. Come back to me if you've still got problems. And then, a number of times later, after they keep doing this, they'll start running get help first. And then they're not bothering you because they're figuring this out. If they do have problems, great. It means they've read the help and tried things. You can also do things with about files. So if you've never had a look or are curious, if you do get help about star, there's a whole ton of about files, which are kind of like descriptive files about more general concepts than specific functions. They're really good for documenting your module as a whole or specific processes involved in your module, and any sorts of concepts that come across that way that doesn't really fit in the help about a specific function, but you still want to document and make available to users. So let's have a quick look at that. So if we go back to here, so I do get help about star. Let's maximize this because so there's a lot of help files here. So that's still going. So yeah, there's a ton of useful documentation here that can help you about all sorts of how do all the different comparison operators work? How does a for and for each parallel work? And other things. Very useful to review those occasionally if you're like, oh, I'm getting stuck working on how to make something work. So I get help about star. Say I want to do stuff with workflows. Workflow star. Get me all of the help files about workflows, and now I can go and have a look at that and figure out what I'm doing wrong with workflows or what I need to know more about workflows. And these are all online as well if you wanted to go digging around in those. I often find the web versions not just more up to date, but easier to read, because the console isn't always great for that sort of thing. So that was a side note there. So let's have a look at a build file. So this is considerably more complicated than it probably needs to be, but it's kind of evolved over a number of iterations, a number of different modules I've been working on. So firstly, we install ps-depend and then download all my dependencies. So if I show you a dependency file, so this is a ps-depend file. It just says, I need all of these modules installed to be able to build my module correctly. So I've got configuration, which is a module for handling PSD1 files, tester, of course, because I've got tests, platypus for my documentation, script analyzer to make sure I've got the latest version so I can actually analyze my code, and then things that my module requires when I actually deploy it, but I also need them for building so my tests will run, because my test boxes almost certainly won't have any of these on. It'll probably have test run and an old version of script analyzer. So yeah, my build file downloads all of that. I then go looking for my PSD1 file, because although the module folder knows it's going to know what it's called, this build script I move around, I have multiple copies of, and I don't particularly want to have to keep updating it. So I'm just like, nice and simple, find me all the PSD1 files that aren't in my output folder, that do contain the word root module, since only module manifests will contain that unless I've done something very wrong with writing PSD1 files, and then just grab me the very first one you find. We then get set up some output folders. So I put everything into an output folder. That's just what I find a bit easier. You can call that whatever you really want. I know some people call it the same thing as their module, and then they can point their PS module path at that folder and it'll all figure itself out, and you can just import your modules. I set up some extra paths for my new PSD1 and my PSM1 file, and I copy my current module manifest because I'm quite happy with it as it is for the most part. I just need to update a few things a bit later on in this process. I remove any existing PSM1 files in my output folder because I'm going to overwrite it anyway. I find all of my public and private functions by doing some simple get child item in these folders and get me all of the PS1 files. And then, quite simple, just loop over all my functions, get the content, add the content to my PSM1 file. And then the same again for public functions. After that, I get all of the function names where I'm expecting verb-noun, and I export those as module members, and I also update my module manifest with functions to export for that value. So in theory, all of my function files should have the same name as my function within them. But I know I screw up sometimes on these things when I'm renaming functions or files and forget to do one of them. So that's why I'm making sure I grab it from within the file, because then I know it's the correct, it's the actual thing I want to export. And then I invoke Pester and I invoke Script Analyzer. So it's quite a, it feels like quite a long-winded and complex process, but it's covering all of the bases I needed to cover when I run it locally. So if I give this a quick run, hopefully this will work. It doesn't usually, at least not in demos. So we can see the first things it does is download some dependencies. This usually takes 20 or 30 seconds because I already have them all installed. As it keeps going. There we go. So it's figured out where my modules are. It's figured out where my output file should be. I've already got them there, but that's fine. It's replaced the PSM1 file and the PSD1 file with functions to export. So my functions to export is updated with all of the different functions I'm actually exporting. I've still got some stars in here, so I need to fix that. I'll have to make a note of that. And then my tests just continue running. And all I've had to do for that is just hit F5. Because, as I mentioned earlier, I have a VS Code folder with a launch.json. And in here, I just say, run my build PS1 file in the current working directory. And these tests continue running. But this whole process makes things a lot easier for me when I'm developing locally, because it means I can write some tests or write some more code for a function, hit F5, run my full test suite, make sure I haven't broken anything. And then once I know it works locally and it's done, I can push it to my remote repository, let my CI process take care of it to make sure it's run on a completely clean box and make sure it still builds there. Those tests fail because I haven't written the code to fix those yet. The advantage of being halfway through on a branch. Disadvantage, I guess. I apparently have a lot more tests than I expected to have, or thought I had. There you go. So I get some code coverage output. I see I failed 2 of my tests, so I need to go back and have a look at those. And Script Analyzer runs and says, you don't have any help there, and you're doing some should process stuff. You should probably sort that out. So that whole process took what, just under 3 minutes, which feels like quite a while, but generally I'll hit F5 and then start working on some other piece of code or making some changes that I know I need to make, tidying up some help or something. So that whole thing makes my life considerably easier, makes other people coming to the project's lives easier, and keeps everything nice and structured and working quite well. I have all my docs as Markdown files. I know some people prefer to keep it as comment-based help. I've got it as Markdown files so that I can publish the online versions directly to our wiki because we're using Azure Devops services. So it makes life a bit easier just having it all as Markdown and exporting the external help for use in my actual module. So I think that's everything I want to show off about modules, build scripts, running it. So on the subject documentation, actually, that note reminded me. There was a great talk last year at the PowerShell Summit by Michael Lombardi about all the very different types of documentation, and the list is considerably longer than I would have expected. And it was a very, very interesting talk about documentation, which is generally not an interesting subject, but he made it very interesting and covered a lot of really useful points. So I'd definitely check that one out if you're wanting to look at any of the interesting sessions from last year. So, any questions? That's quite a lot of things to take in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, we did have one question from the chat room, and before I get to the questions, I just want to point out to you, Chris, that we have comments and we have the description available to us. So don't feel like you have to be super comprehensive in your answers right now. If you feel like you can provide some links or some description later, you can DM me those, kind of at your leisure, and I'll update the video description in the comment with some more detailed stuff. But we did have a question from the chat room. Do you have any favorite resources or blog posts or something like that that you use to learn about the process of compiling modules, or do you have any favorite tools that you use, that kind of thing?
So I don't think there's that many blog posts about it yet. I know I'm in the process of writing one, and I have been for a few weeks/months. As for tools, there's a really good module called Module Builder by J. Cole and a few others. A few of us got together at PowerShell Summit and MVP Summit last year to start working on this sort of thing. So Module Builders went public not long ago, and that's pretty good for helping to automate all of that actual compilation process, and it handles classes and a whole bunch of other really cool things. And that's on GitHub and on the gallery.
Very cool. Maybe I'll ask you later, and we can get a link up in the comments. I will ask the audience to formulate their questions in person, and while they think about those, I'll just ask you real quick. You mentioned that you maintain some DSC resources. What kind of DSC resources do you maintain, and do you just want to plug them real quick?
So I maintain the CADFS module, which is the DSC resource for working with ADFS. I've got one for web application proxy. There's one for GIA, just enough administration. I've been working on quite a lot recently. I maintain a couple of internal ones as well, and I can't remember what the other ones are. They're all on my.
A quick, like a 30-second, what GIA is for some of the audience maybe on the recording that don't know?
Yeah, so GIA is a way of allowing non-admin users to perform admin tasks, but on a much more limited scope. So if you've got some help desk people who need to reset passwords, then you can enable GIA endpoints through PowerShell remoting that only lets them do get AD user and set AD account password, I think is the command. And you can restrict what parameters they can pass to it, what values they can pass to those parameters. There's a whole bunch of really awesome stuff you can do with it. And it's all about giving users only the admin privileges they need to perform their tasks, rather than the classic way of everyone gets domain admin and like you come in the next day and everything's on fire. And yeah, so Gia is really cool for allowing that functionality and minimizing the security issues you're likely to run into. It's only for PowerShell remoting, but that's generally not a problem because you don't really want people RDPing into servers much anyway, especially if it's like help desk guys or people who don't need to. Like your SQL guys don't need to RDP into their SQL servers. They've got SQL Management Studio and other similar tools for doing that.
Yeah, so I'll just point out for some of the listeners that GS stands for Just Enough Administration, JEA, and it's really one of those, to me, it's a lot like managed group users. It's one of those security technologies that is just way underutilized, and I really wish more people used it. I wish Microsoft made it easier to use, I'll say that, but I do wish they used it a lot more. Did we have any more, did we have any questions from the in-person audience, by the way?
In case of DSC and GA, what was the use case?
Right, were you able to hear that question, or should I repeat it?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah, sure. So when you say that you maintain a DSC module for GIA,
Yeah.
how does that work? How do you administer GIA with DSC?
I will show you. So it's on my GitHub. So the way it works is it's for managing the actual configuration files. Originally, it was produced by Microsoft, but it kind of died off with them. So I've got some resources for managing the session configuration files and the role capabilities files. You just pass in your values and it generates those files for you in the right place. So I do know there is a bunch of work going on about GIA by a couple of PFEs, and there should be quite an interesting module coming out soon to make the whole management of GIA a lot simpler. It's not using PSP, but yeah, it's coming out in the next week or so, I believe, from talking with them about it.
And are we talking about a regular PowerShell module or another DSC module?
Yep, regular PowerShell module. From what I was heard, it would handle a lot of things like creating the endpoints and stuff, and creating the role capabilities based on scripts that you provided, and a whole bunch of other really cool stuff.
I'm personally really excited about you mentioning that, because I'd really love to see that. Yeah. Does that, great. Just a personal question for you. How long have you been doing PowerShell, and what got you interested in it? And was there like a light bulb moment where you're like, man, this is great stuff?
So I've been doing for 5 or 6 years now, I think. And I think I started in the same way most people do. I used to do IT support, and it was kind of we need to do creating AD users. So because I worked in a school at the time, so we had like 200 kids starting each year, and you're like, I don't want to deal with manually creating these or the older batch and VB script tools. I looked up some PowerShell for it, took a CSV file, and had 200 users in a matter of minutes. And then it moved on to things like exchange automation. We like whose mailboxes are too big, like pulling all that sort of data out, and then it kind of clicked how much power there was in it, and I went on from there with automating large chunks of my job, which was great.
Yeah, that's great. Automating yourself out of one job and maybe finding another.
That's my goal. Yes, always try and automate myself out of the job.
Yeah, I love that. I really love spreading that mentality. Automate yourself out of one job and find something more interesting to do.
Yeah.
All right. So, did you have any last minute things you wanted to cover? Any things you wanted to just touch on?
No. The only other thing is there's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or Slack if you're on there. If you're not, join us on Slack, check out my GitHub and my blog. And yeah, if you've got any questions, feel free to contact me.
I think we've got one last in the audience. Go for it.
Experience generating DSC scripts dynamic.
Right. So the question is, do you have any experience possibly generating DSC scripts dynamically?
I do a little bit. Do you mean the actual configuration files or the resources?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The resources themselves.
So I've not done much on that side of things, but I could probably have a look into it and give you some pointers if there's anything specific. Drop me a message on Twitter or Slack, and we can have a look at it. That sounds like quite an interesting idea, actually.
Yeah, we'll try to get you a more detailed question there, and we'll touch base. Hey, Chris, I want to say thanks for coming again so early in the morning for you at this point. We really appreciate it. I'll touch base with you tomorrow. I'll let you get some sleep for now and won't bother you anymore. But we'll touch base tomorrow. And thanks for coming, man.
Not a problem. It's good. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.
You too.